which provided funds for me to come to the symposium, in addition to the colloquium, or as part of coming to the colloquium in my role with Concord Ireland. But those in particular are the Health Research Board in the Republic of Ireland and the Research and Development Office in Northern Ireland, which jointly fund my role across the island of Ireland, which I think is an example of the way that a place that has had plenty of conflict in the past, and conflict is often the source of disasters, or at least a complication on top of natural disasters. But I think we're showing that we can move past some of those in some areas. My talk is going to look at research ethics in the context of disasters and humanitarian emergencies. And my interest in this whole area has a lot to do with Mike. If you know Mike for a while now, you'll know that every now and then you'll get a call, or you'll bump into him and he'll say, "Have you ever thought about helping out on this or that?" And so Mike approached me a number of years ago, and he knew that I'd been involved in Cochrane for a couple of decades now, but also that the other part of my academic interest is in ethics, and as part of that, research ethics. And so he said, we're getting this initiative of EvidenceAid up and running, and we realize if we're going to call on more people to do research in the context of disasters and humanitarian settings, we need to get the ethical parts of these thought through. And so he asked me to look at what those were, what sort of evidence was there around the research ethics areas. And that started me on this path, which led to an article, which then led to a conference, and that led to now a network that I'm coordinating called Disaster Bioethics, which is a cost action, means it's funded by the EU, which is bringing together both NGOs and ethicists to really look at the types of ethical issues that arise in disasters. And one of those really is the whole area of how to do good research. We have a workshop coming up next October where we're bringing together some people to really look at this in a lot of depth. But actually the tsunami that we've heard a lot about this morning already was the trigger for a group in Asia that have really laid some of the groundwork in this whole area. They, led by Atula Sumatapala from Sri Lanka, who has led to a set of guidelines that have been put forward to really look at ethics in this context. But it was interesting listening to Pratap's talk this morning, because Atula is a psychiatrist as well and was concerned about the exact same types of issues about debriefing in Sri Lanka, where he was living at the time, and the tsunami struck, and came to very similar conclusions, and has since published research that has very similar findings to what Pratap was talking about. But ethics, more generally then, is looking at the issues of right and wrong. And tragically, research ethics has a list of things that have been done in the wrong way in the past. Some of these horrifically bad in the context of Nazi Germany and other examples involving particularly mental health patients and development of vaccines using orphans and various types of things like that. But I think sometimes these kind of huge tragedies in the area of medical research and ethics will sometimes overlook the fact that there are often ethical problems and concerns on a much more everyday type of basis. And this is where ethics sometimes gets very much focused on the approval stage of research, or sometimes highlights the really big problems in this area, but misses the fact that there are ethical decisions happening on a daily basis when researchers are doing their work. So part of what I'd like to comment on this morning is the importance of taking this side of ethics seriously, as well as the more formal regulatory end of things. And within ethics, there is concern not just for regulation, not just for principles and theories and guidelines, but also the ethical virtues, which are much more difficult to grasp because they're much more personally connected. They deal with the personal characteristics of individuals. But just in the same way as we may have a guideline or a principle talking about the importance of truthfulness or of identifying things accurately, there's the personal side of being an honest person. And this is where the researcher is going to be faced with numerous decisions. Am I going to report this exactly as I found? Well, what if I just kind of tweaked it a little bit? That would fit the statistical package a little better. That would make for a more clear-cut publication. And maybe I could just, nudge it slightly. And I think what we see in some of the really big tragedies in research ethics is that it sometimes starts with a little nudge at the beginning to kind of tweak it slightly. And the next thing is you have huge problems, such as was revealed recently in the area of biomedical research, that it eventually led to the uncovering of completely fraudulent reporting of results that in one case with the supervisor not directly involved in the fraud, but supposed to be supervising the person who did carry out the fraudulent activity, who has ended up committing suicide because of not being able to cope with realizing what went on in his watch. So there's this personal side that we need to really capture. There is also the realization that ethics is not going to solve the problems. Ethical decision-making is really a method of looking at certain types of dilemmas and challenges. But as this nice short book on moral philosophy points out, I really like this, that ethics is not going to find a decision for you. But part of what it tries to do is to remove some confusions, clarify some obscurities, so that the options stand out more plainly. And it's when we start to see that there is an option that I'm given here. Are we going to go this way or that way? Are we going to look for an alternative approach because the only clear options seem to be full of ethical challenges? We need to then go looking elsewhere and identify some different way that we can do things, because the ethical challenges that are laid before us just have too many complexities with them. Another example of really horrendous research that was carried out in the 1950s was uncovered by a historian recently, and this led to a commission in the US that was set up by President Obama. And I am glad that as part of the report, they not only focused on the historical settings that led to this type of research, but that they highlighted that, again, while we have much regulation in place today compared to the 1950s, what really needs more attention is the personal side, that research teams and research training needs to take account of the ethical components of the training and of putting into young researchers some of these ethical virtues. As they say, that what's needed in going forward here is a focus on the internal ethical motivations of individual investigators, not only the rules and regulations that externally motivate investigators towards compliance. Now, this is certainly going to be really challenging, because we know it's difficult enough to teach about regulations or to carry out an approval process. But are we now going to be digging in and asking the researchers about, just how are you ensuring that your data is accurate? Or how are you developing your honesty levels within yourself or other types of ethical virtues? They certainly are challenging, and they reflect, I think, much more of the kind of apprenticeship role that is traditional in healthcare professions, and the picking up of bedside manner or respect for patients that's part of clinical practice and clinical training, but that needs to be incorporated into research training as well. Again, this is not anything new, but again, as other concerns in the past were being revealed about research ethics problems. Henry Beecher published what is regarded as probably one of the more influential articles in the area of medical ethics, where he identified the crucial neglect of informed consent in clinical research that had been going on up until the 1960s, and advocated for a much greater attention to informed consent in a research context. But he also pointed out, again, the importance of the virtues in research, and unfortunately, his second recommendation of his has not been developed or pushed as much as the first one around informed consent. But he said that what is really needed for ethical research is the presence of an intelligent, informed, conscientious, compassionate, responsible investigator. So again, how can our research training, how can our promotion of research and evidence include a concern for these types of issues as well, and engaging with this personal side of what can sometimes be more of an objective or a data-driven set of concerns. There is a really good article in the area of clinical research that has laid out 7 values that are really crucial for good medical research to be ethical. And what I'm going to do is put through these 7 in the context of disaster research and humanitarian research. Because I think while they were developed for a clinical setting, and there are some unique aspects to clinical settings that often don't translate very well into a disaster type of setting, I think they provide a really good set of ideas and values that we should be looking for and finding ways to identify. So one of those big differences between research in a public health context and clinical research that has to be kept in mind is that there is often a greater concern for the population in a disaster setting than there would be in an individual clinical research setting. And this is one of the major issues that I think is leading to a lot of thinking and a lot of consideration around this broad area, but it's still something that is really challenging. In a clinical setting and in individual medical research focused areas, there is a great concern for the individual. But when you go into a setting like a disaster, the whole context requires you to think much more about public health settings, about public health ethics. And these are often more focused on the broader group than the individual. That's a major concern that it isn't part of the clinical type of research ethics. So the first of the principles that is brought up in this article and the literature that goes along with it is the value of the research itself. Because I think as we're developing this morning, there is clearly an important place for finding evidence and for evidence then to be able to influence practice and policy. This provides a really important imperative that doing research in a disaster setting can be ethical, that there's an ethical motivation behind it. But this doesn't automatically mean that every type of research you can think of is going to be ethically responsible and ethically appropriate. So we have to look at what is the value of doing this piece of research and of doing it in a disaster context. Is this what is most needed? And I think sometimes we have to admit that there are times when all of the resources should be dedicated towards recovery and towards the medical needs of the people there in order to get some stability into the situation, and so that it may not be imperative that it happen on day one, but that it needs to be done at some point. And part of the ethical imperative is realizing that at all these various points where decisions are being made, as I think it was Crisanta said this morning, just because you want to do something doesn't mean that whatever you decide to do is the best thing. And so we need to have developed the sort of research that is going to provide valuable resources towards those who are responding. And unfortunately, the evidence that's available currently is not that great. The UN a strategy that's addressing disaster preparedness in the yoga framework, reported in its midterm report that all of the research that's currently available is very limited, often of poor reliability and validity, and of limited use. And so even though some research has already been done in these contexts, its value is very limited. And this makes things even more complicated because now you're not even sure if the data you have is actually reliable and of appropriate value. So that's the first ethical principle that needs to be incorporated. The second principle then is that when you've identified research questions, is this particular methodology the most appropriate one to answer these questions? It's one thing to have kind of resources to do some research, people who are available to do it, but then what if they go about doing it in a way that they make some crucial decision about a particular methodological area, a way of sampling the population, or a way of implementing the intervention, where when I think we probably have read studies where you realize, the thing they tested is missing this one thing that in the field we always have to do it slightly differently. So it requires careful consideration about whether the design is really the thing that is most appropriate to the research question. Sometimes you may realize that the feasibility of doing this project in a disaster setting is just not there. That it's just so difficult to actually put this methodology to the test or to bring it to play in the situation, so that we have to come up with some alternative methodology, but again, to be able to focus it on doing it in the way that is most appropriate. Another question now as well is whether it needs to be done right now. Does this have to be done in the midst of a rescue component? Could it wait a few more days to when things are more stable and then research will be better? And then the focus needs to be on the survivors and their needs, not any other concern. And in the kind of history of intervening in humanitarian crises, probably the one example that's brought up of a negative situation is that involving Trovan, an experimental drug that had been approved for treating meningitis in adults, and the company was looking at, had actually gotten approval to do clinical trials in children, but was finding great difficulty in identifying